Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Berlin, and I'm the editor of 97 Things Every UX Practitioner Should Know. And this is the 97 UX Things podcast. We're going to take the contents of the book and have ourselves a nice little podcast with a lot of great UX experts in the field. Today, I am joined by Darren Hood, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, my name is Darren Hood. Thank you, Dan, for having me on the show. Very glad to be here. Very happy to be a part of the book. I love, as we talked about a few moments ago, I love giving back to the UX community. I love educating. I'm not just a UX practitioner, but I'm also an educator. And so to me, that's a big part of the undertow of the book. Let's get everybody built up. Let's get everybody sharpened. Yep. But at any rate, I am what I like to refer to as a first-gen UX practitioner. I designed my first website in 1995, during which time I was doing things that we now do as UX professionals. We didn't call it UX back then. We didn't call those things what we ended up calling them, but I was doing them. And I realized, wow, I've been doing it that long? Really? So I started in 95. I transitioned into UX by way of, I know we're going to talk about this in a bit, but by way of instructional design. And I noticed that there were some things that were parallel between the two. Fell in love with information architecture back then, and the rest is history. And so today I'm a practitioner. I'm currently serving as a senior learning experience designer at Michigan State University. I'm also an adjunct professor in the Masters of UX program at Kent State University. I teach UX-related courses at Lawrence Tech University in Southfield, Michigan, which is where I also reside. Currently working on a PhD in educational leadership. I've got 3 classes to go before I start working on my dissertation. I'm also the producer of the World of UX podcast, which we just celebrated a year anniversary there. So really happy about that. I do so much, man. It's a long introduction.
Sound like a busy man.
I'm the founder of the UX Chit Chat Hour, which is a monthly, like a coffee house chat session for people all over the world in the discipline to just come together and talk about whatever. There's no format. We just come together and we talk. I also just started the new UX only social media venue that we call it Engage, where people just come together and we don't have to worry about the algorithms. We don't have to worry about, you follow who you want, you contribute. And so we're just getting that off the ground. I also just started what we call the Tales from the Indescript comic series, where I'm taking some of the weirdities. Well, that'll be a word for today. The weirdities of the UX practice. And we're just sort of sharing them in a humor-based kind of way. But there's truth in jest in the sense that we're trying to communicate about some things that we need to have on our radar, things that we can manage, things that we should be aware of so that we can take care of those things and optimize our journey. So all of that is me.
Wow.
And then some that I'm leaving out.
And do you sleep?
7 hours a night by design.
Very good. Yeah, and as you alluded to, I'd love to hear about your career trajectory. A lot of folks listening in, either looking to break into the field or wondering just how people wound up, experts in the field. So can you tell us a little bit, where you started and briefly how you got to where you are today?
Absolutely. Like many people who were getting into, again, what we now know as UX, I'm starting to call it experience design. That's really where we reside. Mm-hmm. And like many people, I stumbled into it. There were no programs. There were no UX people at work. When I designed my first website, I thought, I really want this navigation to work. I want it to be easy to understand. I need to make sure that I'm calling these things by the right terms, not knowing that I'm talking about information architecture and nomenclature and findability. I want to test this computer-based training course and make sure that it's working. So I'm going to recruit people around the office, and we're going to do this testing. I didn't know anything about guerrilla testing. I didn't know anything about usability testing. I knew about things like needs analyses and task analyses and things like that. But that's how I transitioned in. So I'm doing all of this instructional design work. But I also, when I designed my first website, as I mentioned, back in 95, I just fell in love with the work. I loved making things easy to use. I loved understanding the needs of the users and the business and finding that sweet spot. as that famous Venn diagram does, the sweet spot between the user needs, the business needs, and the constraints. And I said, you know what? I was about to go to Boise State and pursue a graduate degree in education. And I'm thinking, no, I need to reassess where I'm going. And I took a very close look at where I was, what I really had a passion for. And I felt, you know what? I'm throwing all that out the window. I'm going to mortgage my future, as I like to say, on user experience or information architecture at the time. And I got my first UX related position at Comerica Bank, which is now, it used to be headquartered in Detroit. It's now headquartered down in Texas. And again, the rest is history. I just continued to grow. But for people who are breaking in, a lot of those same things happen. I'm still talking to people who they're at a company where a need arises and they just happen to slot into it. And they start finding out that certain aspects of the discipline exist, and they start to build their knowledge or skill, their acumen, and they continue to go forward. So you've got that group of people that'll do the same thing I did. There were no boot camps. There were no programs. There were no talks being delivered when I was coming up. And then the Polar Bear book came along in 98. Yeah. And that was one of the first books that we really started sinking our teeth into. Jesse James Garrett comes along not too long after that, Alan Cooper. And so those became the people that I depended upon for knowledge downloads so that I could grow. Yep. But eventually I was fortunate also, might as well throw this in, throughout my career, I had the privilege, and I tell people about this all the time, you're only going to be able to grow based on what you're exposed to as far as the direct growth, whatever you're exposed to because of the needs where you work. It just so happened that I started out in information architecture, but we didn't do any research at Comerica Bank, but I was learning a lot from Jacob Nielsen about heuristics. So I would focus on his old book where he taught homepage usability, which changed my life completely. So then I went to, after that, they moved headquarters from Detroit to Texas. And I said, if I'm going to learn more about this, I need to get higher up the food chain. So I went to we thought of it as a conglomerate. The Team Detroit housed multiple agencies. So Ogilvy and J. Walter Thompson and Wonderman Digital, which is the part that I was with, and several other agencies, VML, Y&R, which now today is VML Y&R. They merged. I went there, and then I got exposed to a lot more aspects. So I without going through my whole journey with that, I encourage people, if you're getting on board, please keep in mind, learn as much as you can, because no matter what you are, I'm sort of blending in my tip with this too. One of the tips that I was going to give is that wherever you are, you always want to make sure that if you're a researcher, if you say you start off as a UX researcher, your growth or your ability to bring value as a researcher is not just based upon what you know as a researcher, is based on what you know about the entire discipline. Because the more that you know about heuristics, the more you know about interaction design principles, the more you know about heuristics and usability, the more you know about information architecture, the more on point your research is going to be.
Absolutely.
If all you know is research, you're gonna end up playing guessing games, and which is going to take away from your ability to bring value. So I was fortunate enough, again, throughout my career, to always go somewhere that allowed me to expand my acumen. And then when you don't have that, you've got meetups, you've got talks you can go to, you've got different courses you can take, and then you're going to have to work directly and you're going to have to put forth a conscious effort to make sure that you're growing in all those other areas. Today, I'm doing the same with AR and VR because I've never had the opportunity to work in AR and VR, but I've had the opportunity to give some input about it, but I never had deliverables or any projects. So now I've got to do the same thing. 26 years, and we never stop growing, do we, Dan?
That's the best part of our field, is that we have to, as the technology and as the designs have to change, as do we, and we have to keep up with that, and that's what makes it so fascinating.
Yes, I love it. Yeah. People say, you're going to learn this in 6 months. No, you're not.
Right. Right.
No, right. You're not. In 26 years, I'm still learning, and I actually came up with something I call the UX cycle of excellence. And part of it is, first, you got to define what UX really is. You need to understand what I call the 4 pillars of the discipline: your usability and heuristics, information architecture, research, and interaction and interface design. Examine them, find out if you have any knowledge gaps, knowledge and skill gaps, and then always fill them, and then keep going through that cycle.
Yeah.
And so I'm still doing it again, all these years later, and I'll never stop doing it. And there's always, I love something someone told me yesterday about empirical, which applies to research. When you think about it, UX work is empirical. In other words, nothing we ever do is absolute. Every design can be improved upon.
It's ever changing.
So, yeah, I think about data and trying to understand whether or not the data is trustworthy. Well, we need to have at least 95 or 0.05. We want to get everything down to a 0.05 degree of certainty, which means that there are flaws, which is why even after you come out with something, we're working on the next gen the following week.
Always something to research.
Always something to research, always something to improve. So for that reason, we just keep it going. Just keep it going.
Speaking of keeping it going, let's turn to your chapter. I'd love to hear about your chapter and just to convey to the folks what your chapter's about and some major takeaways there.
My chapter is about making sure to know the difference, knowing and understanding the difference between journey maps and experience maps. Mm-hmm. And the idea for writing this chapter was it sort of had the light bulb went off over my head, because there's always, everybody I interact with, there's always this interchangeability in the mind of the person I'm speaking with of the terms. I have found that in order to excel, one of the things we need to do, not to be the slave of what I call semantics. We're not, you don't hear a swing, just hear a twist on a word and then you're, that's not it. No, in order to understand something, when we're learning something, in order to understand something, one of the first things we need to do is understand the terminology. And so when there's an error in the terminology, that will cause errors in the functionality and then the other activities down the road. So I just kept hearing people, okay, well, we're going to do a journey map. We're going to do a journey map. And I would look, and it's an experience map. And I go to another meeting. We're talking about journey map. And I look, and it's an experience map. And then I look again, and this just over and over and over. And there were very few times that somebody would mention a journey map and it would truly be a journey map. So when you put all that together, that's where I got the idea to write about it. And a passion point, of course, trying to help people to understand, okay, an experience map or a journey map, let's start there. A journey map is a broad view of what's happening along the journey of the users, the customers, the people who are tapping into your resource, your solution, whatever it might be. And when I look at it from a CX perspective, and I've been practicing UX from a CX perspective for the last 6 years, we're looking at things when people first come into contact with your brand. The journey covers everything from that point all the way through where they're actually using your product and service or solution, all the way beyond that to where they get into the customer support part of the experience, which a lot of people think this would sound like service design. And in a sense, it is. It does have a service design. I actually saw a presentation by Don Norman earlier today where he says that he thinks that's where design is headed, into a service design type of mindset. So ahead of the curve again, but it's for everyone's good. That's experience design all the way to the purchasing funnel. So the journey map is going to cover all of these things. The experience map is more narrow in its view. Mm-hmm. It's more focused. It's more specific. So instead of, within a journey map, there could be, we call them touch points. There could be literally 100 touch points, just a number off the top of my head. Could be 50, could be 75. But there are a lot of touch points, a lot of things to examine. With an experience map, instead of covering all 50, 75, or 100, with the experience map, you're selecting certain one, maybe 5, maybe 6, maybe 7. And we're looking at what happens during that experience, what's the sentiment, of the users? Is it a plus point? Is it a pain point? Is it where annoyance takes place? We want to examine the 5, 6, or 7 the elements that have been selected out of the journey, extracted, if you will, out of the journey, and then we want to deep dive those, and then we're also within that, those 5, 6, or 7. We want to identify what are the opportunities here for optimizing, for improving that part of the user experience. So again, the journey map, broad, long term, could take a lot more time to do. Something I mentioned in my chapter in the book. You may not have opportunity, you may not have budget, you may not have time to do a journey map. If you're working in Agile, you're not going to have time to do a journey map, at least not officially. It doesn't mean that you can't do it on your own. I have a history. Do it. I don't even tell anybody. I'm just doing it because I want to understand what's going on, especially when it comes to identifying micro experiences, because that's usually where the problems are. I tell a joke. I say it's a joke, and some people don't laugh about it when I mention it. I mention Comcast or Xfinity, and I have been in talks, and I say, how many of you have Xfinity? And hands go up. How many of you hate Xfinity? And a bunch of the hands go up, and a bunch of laughter ensues beyond that. And I say, well, what if I told you that you really don't hate Xfinity? And then there's the grumbling. And then you see some people, the eyebrows start to go up. And I say, what I propose to you, that your problem is not with Xfinity, it's with micro experiences through Xfinity. And then I prove it. And then people go, oh, and I use that to explain the importance of micro experiences. So if we focus on things from a micro experience perspective, we stand a greater chance of delivering a user experience that the business and the users will all be happy with and be proud of.
And are there different times where you would use one over the other, different types of projects? Or can you give us examples of different types of projects where you would use it one versus the other?
Exactly. I mentioned Agile. With Agile, I used to work for Ryder, and not the car rental division, but the logistics, the ones that deliver a lot of our stuff. And we're working Agile. So we're in 2-week sprints, 3-week sprints. I did not have time to do journey maps, not even on my own. But I did rely on experience maps because I wanted to make sure that the stakeholders understood what was at stake. I guess that's a pun there. I almost want to do my little, might as well do that.
Very nice.
But I needed people to understand what was going on. I was trying to drive a more user-centered approach. So I would extract based on data, based on things that came up during conversations with stakeholders. That's what I used to choose which one of the parts of the experience I wanted to extract to focus on. So in that case, yes, I would use an experience map. If you're in a project where time is not an issue, it is. I remember I worked at another nameless company this time where because we needed to understand the journey, what's going on, where are we hitting the nail on the head, where are we succeeding, where are we failing? We need to have a very holistic understanding of what's going on with the user experience, which would lend itself to a stronger UX strategy, I felt. When those types of things come up, create a journey map.
Yeah.
It's also a good idea to do a journey map when you can. I can't stress this enough. Come up with journey maps and you just got it. You don't have to tell the client, especially if it's an internal client. You don't have to tell the client, but when you can demonstrate that you have an extremely sound grasp and understanding of what's going on in the user experience, that's something that's going to help you bring more value. And something else I'm a big proponent of, where we are always responsible for driving the UX maturity level. So when you have a broad understanding because you've done the journey maps and because you've been doing benchmarking and you have all this great in-depth knowledge, you can always pull from that when you're communicating, which is going to really advance your UX maturity level. It's going to help stakeholders, especially those detractors. Every company has detractors with the stakeholders and the clients who are, why are you here? We don't need you. We've always done it this way. And so the way that the one thing you can always do to help drive and optimize those relationships is to just bring value. How can I bring value? Sit in a room, talk with your UX team. How can we bring value? And you're a champion too. You're going to have a leader who's serving as a champion, one or more, for your UX practice. Get information from them. What can we do that will really resonate? I always talk about what I call speaking exec. We speak UX amongst ourselves, but we got to speak their language when we're interacting with them. Have you ever been in an emergency or at the hospital and the doctors come in and they're looking at you, maybe your broken ankle, or maybe I'm a COVID survivor. And I remember being there and hearing people talk. When they're talking amongst themselves, they talk their language. But then when they came back to talk to the patient, they talked to me in a language I understood. A lot of times the UXers, we talk in our language, and then we go, and I did it early in my career as well, when we're talking with the stakeholders, we keep talking our language and they're going, what? We need to optimize that. And so that's where another element where the journey map will lend itself to your arsenal in a great way.
Mm-hmm. And because it's a micro macro situation, is it safe to say that you can build up a journey map over time using
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a great point. Yes. A journey map, which should take some of the sting out of, I'm not going to do this for a long time. Why are you telling me that? And Dan makes a perfect point that it's something that you don't have to sit down. Okay, I'm working on the journey map and I'm just buried. I'm just going to work on this journey map. Just get pieces of data at a time. Continue to construct it, especially when you're doing it behind the scenes and the client doesn't know about it. Just keep contributing to it. Just keep building it. And then the UX team can talk about that on your own time when the team is getting together, because you all need to know more about who it is that you're serving. And just, I can't stress enough how critically important having that in-depth knowledge is and what it will do for your business, as well as what the perception is, because there's value and then there's value perception.
Yeah.
It's two different things.
And are you using any tools that you can convey that folks can use to help build that over time, or to help build either map?
Yeah, I'll call out 3 tools. 2 of them are direct. 1 is indirect. I'll call out the direct tools first. The first tool is my favorite, so I got to mention them first. I love Custulence.
Okay.
I absolutely love Custulence. I think it a lot of times it lends itself more to the how can I say, just the experience maps as opposed to the journey maps, because when you have something that's blown out too much, it becomes difficult to read and see. But but what it produces is fantastic, and the learning curve to get on board with it is pretty quick.
Gotcha.
There's another product out there called UXpressia, and this is both are web-based, by the way. I like UXpressia. They also have some persona templates and things like that. And some people may find it pretty useful. I think the aesthetics in Custulence are far better than UXpressia. And sorry, UXpressia and Custulence, but it is what it is. So if you don't want me to get out, you know me, you both know me. And so if you don't want me to talk about it, just got to fix it, because if it's out there, I'm going to talk about it. Which leads me to the third one. I have used InDesign, Adobe InDesign, and just done it from scratch. And that's like a fill in the blank. Number 3, it could be InDesign. It could be OmniGraffle. It could be Lucidchart. Any tool that's used to create visuals, Visio, anything that's used, you can actually do it from scratch.
Yep.
And I've seen the best looking experience and journey maps that I've ever seen were all done from scratch. They were not done using tools.
Right.
You have complete control over everything. Some people would just do it in Illustrator and be done with it.
Right.
So, but whatever works for you, of course, that's what you always want to make sure that you run with. But those are the ways to go. And, you always have, at least if you use a tool you've already got, whether it's Illustrator or InDesign, I'm pretty sure you're already paying for it. Whereas if you go with UXpressia or with Custulence, and you've got another dollar figure. And if you go with Custulence, then you got to pay an exchange rate, and that kind of stuff can get a little awkward for some.
Gotcha. Well, this is all great information. Thank you for conveying all this. As we wrap up the session here, I'd love to hear just one piece of advice that you'd like to convey to people breaking into the field.
For people that are breaking into the field, there's so much I could say, but if I have to settle on one, and I talked about this on my podcast recently, and I've done talks on it. I've done a talk recently called Overcoming the Mirage of UX Ambiguity. I've done talks about overcoming UX misinformation, which there's a ton of it. And that's the one that wins out for me. I come across I mentor people all over the world. On a regular basis. People are always knocking down my door on LinkedIn. I started setting up a calendar to schedule time with people so we can talk. And I do this on my own time. And the misinformation that's out there in association with UX is absolutely off the charts. And so there's another concept that I started talking about. I haven't heard anybody else say it, so I'll claim it. I've missed out on the boat doing this in the past, but not this time. So I call it baby bird syndrome. And have you ever seen a baby bird? We've all seen it, and we don't think about it maybe until somebody brings it up. When they're ready to eat, they're passionate. They want that food. That's all they know. Their head is up, their eyes are closed, and their mouth is wide open. And they're just trusting mama bird to drop whatever. What I have found is that when people are fresh into UX, they're just like the baby bird. They are passionate. Their mouth is wide open. And I'll joke and say their eyes are wide shut.
Right.
And so they have no filter. So anytime somebody is offering something that appears to be about UX, they're gobbling it up. And in many cases, you end up having need for a cognitive enema because some information that came through it's not right, or it sets false expectations. And there's a lot of people that are experiencing, and we see it everywhere, whether it's LinkedIn, Reddit, Twitter, wherever. A lot of people they're just frustrated because of the incorrect expectations that they have, because they hear something, and then somebody like me, who is notorious for saying, then they don't have to go through that. If we can get them the right information up front. I also did another talk called the trouble with UX education, where I helped to show them, okay, we went through all of our early years in school with somebody telling us, okay, get dressed, go to school, little Johnny. That's it. And we just went. And when we went, here's the course. Okay. And we went to English. Okay. We went to the math class. Okay. So we went through that for years. Later in life, we take charge of that. But we don't necessarily develop the skill to make the proper educational choices. And so it results in, when you put that gullibility, I call it gullibility plus misinformation equals ambiguity.
Well, what's an example of a piece of misinformation you've come across?
One, I'll repeat something I said earlier. Hey, you can learn UX in 6 months. I've even come across something. You can learn UX in 9 days.
Okay.
I've seen that. And I'm like, here I am in year 26, still learning. I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
Not going to happen. Enough. And people expect, or promising you a job.
Right.
Nobody can promise you a job. But people say they get frustrated because they didn't get a job.
Right. Yep.
In 6 months. But nobody ever should have told you that. And as an educator, I know that pedagogy is a science. And so the pedagogy, people don't know that pedagogy is a science, and they don't know that pedagogy, if it's not structured correctly, you should avoid that resource. Yep. They don't know that. All they hear is the promises, and they opt in, and then they run off with your $15,000, and here they leave you stuck here with your hands in the air crying, and they don't come back to check on you
with some misset expectations. Yep. Yeah. Those expectations have to be set right. Yep.
Yep.
Well, Darren, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you not only writing for the book, but taking the time to chat with me today. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Anytime.
Great first episode here. So for everyone listening in, we're going to continue recording these and having one per chapter. Again, go check out the book. It's 97 Things Every UX Practitioner Should Know from O'Reilly. And my guest today has been Darren Hood. And Darren, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks again for having me, Dan. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Goodbye, everyone.